author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Hello and welcome to Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. On today's special show, we're talking the Kamala Harris coronation and Joe Biden's attempt to reform the Supreme Court with just 6 months to go of his presidency. Now, are both of these events more stage-managed than they are political reality? That's what we'll be finding out today. Remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. Welcome to Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio American Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. We're very fortunate to have with us today long-time host of this here radio show and Liberty Nation's senior political analyst, Mr. Tim Donner, who joins us to discuss the Kamala Harris coronation. Thanks for being here, Tim.
Always a pleasure, Mark, of course.
So, Tim, here we are. Kamala Harris has just passed the day of recording, has just essentially been declared the winner of the Democratic Party nomination because there were no other contenders. Now, Tim, I'm sure you're familiar with the term a Hobson's choice. And for those listeners who aren't, it's thought to relate to a 16th century stable livery owner who would tell customers, you can have any horse that you like as long as it's the one closest to the door. Or if we could go with a Henry Ford one, if we prefer.
Yes.
You know, it's you can have it in any color you want, as long as it's black. It really wasn't any choice at all, was it, Tim?
Well, let's think back to the major talking point of Joe Biden when he was still the candidate. It was the threat to democracy. It was that our democratic republic is so shaky that if we elect Donald Trump again, our entire political system will collapse under the weight of an authoritarian. Right? This was the entirety of the Biden campaign because he couldn't run on the economy or inflation or crime or, God forbid, the border, nor on two foreign wars, ground wars that commenced under his watch. He couldn't do any of that. So the entire basis of his campaign was to scare people about Donald Trump because of democracy. Well, let's look at what they've done. Democrats, or shall we say those who are allies of Joe Biden, laid 91 criminal charges on Donald Trump, tried to send him to jail, tried to bankrupt him, tried to take him off the ballot. And now they took their own candidate off the ballot and decided that a woman who had never received a single vote, by the way, in 2024 or 2020, when she ran her own face plant of a presidential campaign, suddenly now she's anointed as the savior of the Democratic Party. I think at a minimum, Mark, they're going to need to drop this whole threat to democracy thing when Democratic voters were basically given one choice in the primaries and then told, oh, wait, never mind, we'll give you this one other choice. And they're even giving them those choices. In other words, the delegates basically moved en masse to Kamala Harris the day after Biden dropped out. So this is a lot of things, Mark, but it's not democracy.
Yeah, very true, Tim. I think it's really important to understand the process by which Joe Biden first got those delegates, and then the process by which essentially any other potential candidates were blocked out. But I would like to correct you on something, if I may, Tim. You said that Kamala Harris didn't get a single vote during 2020.
I'm sorry,
2020
she
campaign.
got 834. You're correct.
844. Yeah.
She got zero delegates. Okay.
Zero delegates.
All right, thanks for the correction.
You're very welcome. Yes, out of the entire country who could have voted in a primary, she got 844 votes across the entire.
Well, of course.
We shouldn't take those away from her.
Well, what they're doing now is trying to purge, trying to do a Stalinist-like purge on her radical history,
Yeah.
on the fact that she was voted by a neutral site as the single most liberal senator out of 100 in 2019. They're trying to have us
That does
forget
tell
about
you
the fact.
that does tell you something when Bernie Sanders was on that list.
And apparently, Bernie was pretty upset that
Mm.
he didn't finish first, since he's the definitive progressive. But what that says is there's sort of a conundrum with Kamala Harris, because on the one hand, she seems like a person without any fixed political values. On the other hand, she's someone who has bought into every single progressive lunacy idea, to make a word, lunatic idea, from 2020 onward. She wants to ban fracking, wants 70 to 80% tax rates for the wealthy. The list goes so far on. She wants to, she said she would think about abolishing ICE, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency. She thought that adding more police officers to stop crime is wrong-headed. She completely supported the defund police movement. She raised money on behalf of some of the most violent rioters during that summer of hell
She
of 2020
encouraged
after
others
George Floyd.
to donate to.
She did. She
Yeah.
tweeted out for the Minnesota fund that was dedicated to bailing out these violent rioters. So, I mean, the history is so long and so disturbing, so left wing from beginning to end. You say to yourself, well, I guess she's a dyed-in-the-wool progressive. So, I mean, she's a dyed-in-the-wool politician who's decided to pitch her tent on the far left. She decided to do that in 2020, and that will come back to haunt her terribly during this 2024 campaign. Because if you remember the radical environment from 2020, where America is a racist country and we need to defund the police and all that insanity that went on that year, that's now become essentially the Democratic Party position on most things, including Kamala Harris, who goes along for the ride on every progressive idea du jour for toppling the current constitutional system.
Yes, yeah, it's like a reed blowing in the wind to whichever way the power emanates. I think is a good way to look at it. Now let's go back to the primary that never was. So because of Joe Biden's withdrawal, there was the Democratic National Committee set up new rules to allow other Democrats to put their name forward and be considered for the nomination, which sounds like a very democratic way of doing things. But I did an article on this on the pages of libertynation.com where I examined 3 reasons why that was never going to allow any other candidate to come forward. Because the criteria here was that they had to have, anybody who wanted their name put forward had to have 300 delegates out of the almost 4,000, with no more than 50 from each of 6 states. So that meant that they not only had to get 50 delegates or more from their state, but they had to get at least 50 delegates from 5 other states. Now, the issue there is there's only 2 national politicians who have a campaign in place all over the country. That was Joe Biden and Donald Trump. Now, of course, Harris inherited the campaign system and all those offices from Joe Biden when he stepped down and endorsed her, stepped down from the competition and endorsed her. So essentially, anybody who wanted to put their name forward had 10 days to set up a ground game in 5 other states, aside from the one they're in, reach out to delegates, convince those delegates to go against the biggest wishes of all their party leaders and support somebody else. That was number 1. Number 2, they don't even know if they can get donors. They don't know if they have a functioning campaign system in place with 10 days to go. And of course, who wants to upset the apple cart and risk handing the win to Donald Trump? So for these reasons, it seems to me that it was an impossible task for anybody, no matter how popular they are with actual Democrat or potential Democrat voters. What's your take?
Well, I think that Joe Biden upset the entire apple cart when he decided to go back on his pledge to be a transitional figure. I think what they had in mind all along, Mark, was that Kamala Harris would join Joe Biden in 2020, put the Black woman on, or woman of color, more precisely, on the ticket to increase the appeal of a ticket with an old white man on it. And that worked. But I think that was the extent to which they counted on Kamala Harris going forward. I think the idea was that Biden would bow out gracefully as a candidate after a couple of years, probably after the 2022 midterms. And then Kamala would be given a chance along with the actually promising Democratic candidates, perhaps Gavin Newsom, Gretchen Whitmer, Andy Beshear, Josh Shapiro. They have a list of, pretty successful politicians in mixed or even blue states. So they could have, and I think they wanted the idea that Biden would say, okay, I'm not going to run again. And then they'd open the primary and Kamala would have a chance along with everyone else. But when he decided, Biden, to run again, that upset the entire apple cart, because now they had to support him, because a primary would tear the Democratic Party apart. So they pushed everyone else out and said it's Biden or bust. And when they did that, they were left with no choice but to pick Kamala Harris when he dropped out, because with the instability that they were already demonstrating, to throw it open to some wild 30-day, extreme rushed primary would just have given voters the sense that these people don't know what they're doing. Not that they do now, but that would have been an advertisement for chaos.
Not that I've ever seen the show, but I hear there's something called 90 Day Fiancé. This was a 10-day presidential candidate. We'll be back with Tim after this short break. Don't go anywhere.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Welcome back to Liberty Nation Radio. We're here with Tim Donner, longtime host of this here radio show and Liberty Nation senior political analyst. Earlier in the show, we were talking the coronation of Kamala Harris. But now, Tim, I'd like to talk about some lessons that perhaps Miss Harris could learn from overseas. Now, you and I have discussed this quite in depth, I think, but there's something very tangible, a very tangible lesson that can be learned from the July 4th destruction of the Conservative Party in the United Kingdom. And for those who don't know, if I just give the brief background, then you can weigh in on it, Tim. On the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, who was Prime Minister, when he came to power through an internal party election. What should have happened, because in Britain they choose the party, not the candidate. What should have happened was the members of Parliament would have had a vote, the Conservative members of Parliament would have had a vote to determine which two candidates can go forth and campaign among Conservative Party members across the country. But that didn't happen. There was a rule change. And so one of the other top contenders pulled out just a couple of minutes prior to the end. And so Rishi Sunak was installed as Prime Minister without a single person outside of Parliament voting for him.
The key word in that sentence is installed.
Very much so. Yeah.
And that's just the same thing with Kamala Harris, of course.
And then fast forward to the very first election challenge that Rishi Sunak has, which was July 4th, Independence Day, this year. This is the first time he's elected. So he's been in office as Prime Minister for more than a year and a half. And the Conservative Party suffered the worst defeat they've ever had. It essentially wiped them down to a minor party status. And a big reason for that is because Rishi Sunak was never, as the Conservative Party member said, he was never chosen by them. He was not, they were not Team Rishi. They didn't have the choice to vote for Rishi Sunak. And now I'm wondering, Tim, if Kamala Harris might not take heed of that because, yes, she's now the Democratic Party nominee for president in November, but not a single person in America voted for her other than the delegates who were already essentially bound by voting for Joe Biden in the primary.
Well, look, I think what we saw with Rishi Sunak in the UK was a man who was in way over his head. He just wasn't up to the job. And that's the danger of having a selection rather than election. When someone is selected by party elites because they evidently know better than the voters what they should have, this is the kind of thing that happened, that can happen, that did happen in the UK, and that certainly can happen here. I would rewind to about, let's just say, a year ago, before Joe Biden's cognitive deficiencies were unmasked to the degree that they were in that infamous debate. At that point, how many Democrats would have said, let's just go with Kamala. She's a better bet than Biden. Or would they have said, let's open up the process. Let's see what Gavin Newsom has to offer. This guy, Andy Bashir, is a Democrat in a deep red state, Kentucky, and he's popular. What about him? What about Gretchen Whitmer, an attractive, well-spoken candidate? Do you think if this process was open, that Kamala Harris would have prevailed? And I think the answer to that came in 2020, when her much ballyhooed candidacy came roaring out of the gate with a ton of contributions, big funding, and then she puts herself on the map by calling Joe Biden essentially a racist in the first debate. And that was the height of her candidacy because she face planted after that, never even made it to the starting line. So I think we can see how she does in a competitive race. Now, all the people saying she's a different person, how she's grown in the office. Well, if she's grown in the office, then her record as border czar defies that description. She has a lot of splaining to do with.
So, Tim, you've got this situation where Kamala Harris was weighed, measured, and found wanting in 2020. She couldn't win a single delegate. She got humiliated during debate performances by both Tulsi Gabbard, who essentially quoted her own record back at her, by even Joe Biden, who was a little bit sharper then than he is now, but accused her of ignoring issues with segregated schools in California, despite being asked to deal with that segregation issue. And now she's expected to appear on the national stage with, as you point out, a very poor record to run on. And all she really has is the hope that there are more people who don't want Donald Trump back for a further 4 years than who want. But she may have also just been shackled with a plan by Joe Biden that could prove quite disastrous. And we'll be back to talk about that after this short break.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Welcome back to Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio American Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. We're joined once again by longtime host of this here show, Tim Donner. Earlier in the show, we were talking the Kamala Harris coronation. But now, Tim, I want to carry on a similar theme, but more the sword of Damocles that is now also hanging over Kamala's head, courtesy of her boss, Joe Biden. That is the Supreme Court reform push that he announced in recent days. What's your take on that?
Well, my initial take, Mark, is that if he was serious about the need to reform the Supreme Court to the extent that he said he is in his op-ed in Washington's most prominent newspaper, in his speech at the LBJ Library in Texas, he would have done it in the first 6 months. That's the honeymoon period. That's where a president is on a long leash, where he can propose things with the, basically investing his high approval rating into something that he feels has to be done that probably wouldn't be able to do in a second term or during a subsequent presidential campaign. But instead, with one foot out the door, in a position where he's not going to be evaluated anymore with this proposal because he's not on the ballot. He says of a system that he has upheld during a 50-year career, we're in a crisis in the Supreme Court, and we need to tear it all down, root and branch, add in term limits, give every president the right to appoint a justice every 2 years, this code of conduct, whatever that's worth. It's simply a way to demonize the conservative justices, particularly Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito. It's really a political gambit that will go absolutely nowhere, and he knows it. The chance of getting a 28th constitutional amendment when he's 6 months from the end, most people don't think, or many at least don't believe he's even really up to the job anymore, and he's going to unleash a movement for a constitutional amendment aimed specifically at Donald Trump and upend the entire Supreme Court. I mean, come on, give me a break. But to the matter of Kamala Harris, if this was serious, again, she would have proposed it. Because him proposing it, he's a dead letter. He's a dead man walking politically. There's nothing that he's going to say from here on in that anybody's going to take very seriously, because he's the lamest of lame ducks as a sitting president who isn't seeking re-election. So it's just a gambit to get some publicity, get the left wing all riled up and say, this is what we wanted all along. But if I'm a Democrat who wants Supreme Court reform, I'd be saying what I started my remarks with, which is, why didn't you do it when it was possible for it to be taken seriously or even instituted?
Well, it's funny that we're talking about he could have done it in his honeymoon period of the first 6 months. But the man's been in Washington, D.C. for 5 decades. If there was any inkling that he thought that the Supreme Court, you know what, there's a problem with the Supreme Court, perhaps we need to look at some remedies, it would have happened before he got into office. And
well,
there
this is a man. This is, the man from Scranton who wears his patriotism on his sleeve and everything. And for 50 years, he bent like the wind to whatever sort of current agenda the Democrats were pushing, whether it be more centrist during the Clinton days, more leftist during the Obama days. But Joe Biden is, a man whose career is all but over. And I think it shows you, look, the one way I think that Kamala Harris could dispel the ideas that all of us have about her lack of core beliefs, about her progressive ideology that she bends to, which is a conundrum there. But she has a chance to dispel all of those notions. She's got the national stage for the next 100 days, give or take. So she has every opportunity to prove all those naysayers wrong. But the way you do that is you present yourself as a national leader. You show up when the Prime Minister of Israel makes a speech to a joint session of Congress, and you sit behind him even though you hate Israel. which essentially she does. She's aligned with all the anti-Semitic, anti-Israeli, anti-American forces that have exploded around the world. And what you do is you introduce serious reform as a candidate. You don't let the guy you're replacing do the heavy lifting and do the dirty work of announcing something explosive like this. And then you just say, oh, well, I support the president's plan. And the way this is rolled out does not give anybody the sense that Kamala Harris is a serious person any more than we thought she was, but she's still got the chance to do it. She's got a lot of heavy lifting ahead of her.
It's actually just occurred to me here that perhaps there's something at play here, that Joe Biden proposes this kind of reform, and then Kamala Harris can essentially say, if it starts polling very badly and people start thinking, well, hang on, they're about to dismantle.
That was his idea. That was his idea.
It
right.
allows her the opportunity to slip away. However, if it proves popular amongst poll groups, which is really how people seem to be running campaigns nowadays, she can say, well, you know what, Joe and I discussed this a lot, and this is something that we discussed together that I could carry the torch forward for. Then she can adopt it as her own. Alternatively, she's got a third. So she can either A, adopt it fully, B, she can deny it and say, this is not the way I want to go, I want to be a more measured leader. Or she has a third option, doesn't she? She could say that, you know, I know that a lot of people are worried about perhaps the extremity of reforming root and branch the systems that have kept our country at peace for 200 years more. And that is, I want to offer a slightly different version that doesn't seek to gut the pillars of the United States. And then she can be seen as a moderate or a moderator of difference. Yes. And that's a third option.
She could, but she won't. I mean, she could, but she won't.
I think she might if it's politically
terrified. She's terrified of her progressive base, just like Joe Biden was. He was dictated to by the progressive base. He made a deal with Bernie Sanders to put so many of Bernie's people into his cabinet. He's bowed to basically most of the unreasonable Democratic demands for upending the Supreme Court, abolishing the Electoral College, packing the Supreme Court, this sort of thing. But she, Kamala Harris, essentially supports all of that, or has in the past, and now will be in a position to have to say, remember what I said about banning fracking, how I'm definitely going to ban fracking. Well, I didn't really mean it. I changed my mind. There's new information about fracking that has caused me to change my mind. See, this is something that a clever politician, an Obama, a Clinton, could pull off. It's not something that a Hillary Clinton or a Kamala Harris or a clumsy politician will be able to pull off, especially at this last-minute emergency campaign to become president of the United States.
Let's just very, very briefly, Tim, before we wrap this segment up, let's talk about what if in some bizarro world any support came through for the actual amendments he's talking. And I just want to say, you're a guy very familiar with the Constitution. LibertyNation.com is set up to examine the issues of today through the lens of the Constitution, and that's I think that's an important role that Liberty Nation serves. But it seems to me that the whole purpose of lifetime appointments for the Supreme Court is because people aren't looking for an exit. They're not looking for what do I do after this, because they'll be vilified by half the country. So they got to look after what they're going to do when they leave office, right? If there's a term limit. So doesn't that make whatever decisions are made by any of these new Supreme Court justices under the 18-year term limit proposed by Joe Biden, doesn't that make them political actors and therefore politicize the court far more than the alleged MAGA extremists that are on it?
That is the best description that I've heard of why term limits are a terrible idea. But it's also the best description of exactly what the Democrats want to do. They want to politicize the one non-political branch of government. And we shouldn't be surprised because they have relied on the courts to ram through unpopular progressive ideas that got no traction at the ballot box. So they used the courts to try and push them through as hard as they can. And now they can't do that because it's a 6-3 conservative majority. Look, this is hate. This is envy. This is fear. This is fury. Biden and Harris and the Democrats are furious that Donald Trump got 3 appointments in 4 years and was able to change the court, basically change the whole face of the Supreme Court through the system. But this is what happens when a party is driven by emotion and by one-step thinking, as the Democrats are. We're upset that he got all those appointments. Trump got 3 in 4 years. Biden only got 1. It's not fair. Let's tear down the system and make it in our own image. This is exactly what this is. They're furious. They're envious that Trump got a chance to redefine the court and they have to live under it. The degree of fury and envy involved in that is almost incalculable.
If I may borrow a term from Dean Wormer of Animal House, envious, furious, and hateful is no way to go through life.
Through life.
We'll be back with Tim.
It's always good, Mark. I love when you quote the great philosophers.
The great philosophers. We'll be back with Tim after this short break. Don't go anywhere.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back on Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. Now, Tim, we've really run the gamut on what's happening with Kamala Harris, with the Supreme Court Refrain promoted by Joe Biden. Now, I want to delve a little bit more into the practicalities of the Kamala Harris campaign, and specifically the surrogates that she's employing, and because it seems to me, if I may go off on a slight tangent here, Kamala Harris isn't actually campaigning. She's allowing the Fourth Estate to campaign on her behalf. All of a sudden, she's a viable candidate when in 2020 she managed to accrue 844 votes out of the millions cast in the Democrat primary. And so
that's one of your favorite metrics, Mark.
It's one of my favorite metrics. It's in England we use we did often use the imperial system, and then we got taken over by the metrics. So we're coming back to the imperial. And I know in America,
not a moment too soon.
3 cheeseburgers to the bald eagle is your measurement system or something. This piece of wood is 15 liberties past the freedom fries. I know we have these various metrics, but my favorite metric is 844 primary votes out of potentially millions. But let's talk about the campaign and how it's other people running it for her. And there's something that's really stuck out to me, Tim. I'm a Chinophile. I'm a student of Chinese history, especially recent history. I have a lot of connections to the country in terms of my time spent there and the people I know there. And one thing seems to just keep cropping up in my mind, and it's the idea of struggle sessions that became very popular in the 1920s and 1930s, and obviously continued through the great cultural revolutions and the great leap forwards of the later days of Chinese communism. And these struggle sessions were where people would, I'm sure you know what they are, where people would denigrate themselves, humiliate themselves in the self-criticism that was a very Soviet theme at the time, and it happened in Soviet Russia too. And they would do that because it would benefit the party. And now what we see is these cringeworthy, disgraceful displays of such things as, and I'm sure you've heard this, white dudes for Harris. And it's these hundreds of thousands of people on these joint Zoom calls where essentially they're saying, I'm a white person, I'm for Kamala Harris, and here's the privilege that I have, here's the damage that I've done to society, and yet I can make up for that.
Self-flagellation.
Oh, it's
self-flagellation. That's if you hearken back to that horrible summer of 2020, the kind of people you're talking about were the ones who were brought into line and told to admit their privilege, to apologize for it, and to become not opposed to racism, but anti-racist. And the difference is these kind of people were told, you can't just say you're not racist. You've got to get out there and actively pursue social justice. Those are the kind of people, the white dude, so to speak, that are behind Kamala Harris. But, you know, it reminds me of something that we're also seeing contemporaneously. This idea, first of all, Kamala Harris, if you look at her first three events as a presidential candidate, she went to Indianapolis to talk to a Black female sorority. Presumably, those are people who were already probably planning to vote for her in a state she has no chance to win. And then she goes to Wisconsin, yes, but after that, she goes to Massachusetts to raise money, a state she can't possibly lose. So what that tells me is, yes, you're right, it's a surrogate campaign. She can't carry the burden by herself. And to be fair, in 100 days, it's too much to ask her to do that. So she's going to have to rely on surrogates. She's going to have to pick, in my view, the VP candidate who is the single best campaigner she can find, because she's going to need it.
Yes, she'll have to put almost all of the crowd draw on people that she's appearing with rather than just her. I believe, and I don't know how true this is, but she had a big performer turn up at a campaign event prior to her. And then the reports started coming in that about 5 minutes after the big performer had finished the show, people started leaving, and that left just the core of Kamala supporters. Now, I don't know how true that is. It could just be,
My guess, though, Mark, in fairness, Mark, I think the residual crowd for Kamala Harris was still probably exponentially larger than the biggest crowd that Joe Biden got in the entire campaign. Oh, yeah.
Yes, very much.
I mean, there's real enthusiasm for her here. This is the rollout. She's going to be on a roll here until the convention. She got the hit for joining the campaign. She got the hit for raising, $200 million in pent-up contributions. She'll get another hit when she picks the VP. And my guess is it'll be Mark Kelly, the senator from Arizona, but there's other good candidates. And then she'll get a fourth hit at the Democratic convention where she can read a speech off a teleprompter effectively, and for her sake, hopefully mute the cackle. And she could come out of the convention in pretty good shape, but that's when the real campaign begins. That's when Donald Trump will begin to dismantle her piece by piece. And I suspect by the time we get to November, there will be a distinct minority of Americans who believe that Kamala Harris can handle the job of commander-in-chief with the world on fire and the country on fire. That's my prediction.
We'll see how that prediction plays out. I suspect you might be right. Tim Donner, thanks ever so much for joining us.
Pleasure, Mark.
And that's all we have time for on this week's special edition of Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network from our flagship station in the nation's capital, WWRC in Washington, D.C. I've been your host, Mark Angelides. I'd like to take a moment to thank our guest today, longtime host of this here show and Liberty Nation's senior political analyst, Tim Donner. And of course, extend my gratitude to you, the listeners, for taking the time each week to tune in and join us here on the station.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.